Chapter 5 The Bookseller, the Sockman, and the Glipwood Township. The Igby children raced across the cottage lawn, though that was only as fast as Lily could hobble. Janner resisted the urge to offer her his help. He had learned long ago that his little sister was capable of getting around on her own, and that if she wanted help, she'd ask for it. He also knew that while she was fiercely independent, she fiercely wanted them to wait up for her, too. Even with a crippled leg, Lily was remarkably fast, and her brothers moved at a trot as they wound down the shady lane that led to the town of Glipwood. Nugget padded alongside Lily, wagging his tail, and if the Igby children had had tails, they would have wagged too. They could already hear the uncommon sound of laughter from the direction of town, and wisps of happy music lifted over the tops of the oaks. Janner suddenly felt pleased to be entrusted with the care of both his younger siblings. He laughed at how quickly his feelings had changed. Only minutes ago, he felt chained down by his responsibility. Now he was proud of it. Going to town alone with Tink and Lily was a far song from sailing alone in the open sea like his father had done, but it would have to do for now. Janner wondered what his friend old Oscar N. Reteep at the bookstore would say when he saw the Igbys with no parents in sight. Would Oscar give him more work in the store or let him take home more books? Maybe he'd finally allow Janner to read the books reserved only for older folks, the thick ones on the top shelves with the ancient binding. He smiled to himself, for responsibility might not be so bad after all. "So what happened back there?" Tink asked as they jogged down the lane. "Nothing." "What do you mean, nothing?" Tink sounded disappointed. "No spanking? No smaking." "So when you're 12, you can be a stinker and not get whomped?" "It's complicated," Janner said, thinking again of his father. He wondered when he'd show Tink and Lily the picture. "I can't wait to be 12, Tink grinned deviously, and they rounded the corner onto Main Street. Janner smiled back at his brother, but inside he was troubled. Esben Igby, he thought. Knowing his father's name made Janner think of him as a real person, not just a happy shadow from his dreams. Many days he didn't think much about him, but whenever the other children in Glipwood spoke of their fathers, or when they asked Janner why he lived with his old grandfather, he felt like an oddity. He knew that Lily and Tink felt it too. Everyone else in Glipwood had grown up there or somewhere nearby. Everyone else in Glipwood had grown up there or somewhere else. But whenever Janner asked Podo or Nia where they had come from, the answer was always silence. All he knew was that Podo had grown up in the cottage, and that his great-great-great-great-grandparents, Janner's great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, Ed and Yamza Helmer, had built the cottage 200 years earlier, when Glipwood was little more than a cluster of buildings. Now Glipwood had one main street with several buildings on either side. Shaggy's Tavern stood on the left, its dark green shingle bearing a picture of a dog with a pipe hanging from its mouth. Beside it was the biggest building in town, Glipwood's Only Inn. Its sign read, "The Only Inn," at the top, and below that, in smaller letters, Glipwood's Only Inn. The Schusters, a kindly old couple, kept the inn warm and clean, and the smells that floated out of the kitchen made the whole township hungry. Across the street was a barber shop called J. Bird's, where Mr. Bird usually could be seen sleeping in one of his chairs. Next to the barber shop squatted the town jail, where Fangs lounged on the stoop and hurled insults at passerby. Wide, mossy oak trees stretched their boughs over the streets, offering welcome shade from the summer sun. Children with sticky faces straddled high limbs, munching on various desserts. Everywhere Janner looked were men and women of different shapes and sizes. The women wore long, flowing, brightly colored gowns, and the men who strolled beside them puffed pipes and sported silly, round-topped hats. Occasionally a horse-drawn carriage would squeak by, its occupants peeking smugly out the window. Janner, Tink, and Lily, with Nugget by her side, made their way through town, past the inn, always full this time of year, being Glipwood's Only Inn, past Farinia's flower shop and the old rickety building that housed books and crannies. A sign hung in the window, Oscar N. Reteep, proprietor, bookseller, intellectual, appreciator of the neat, the strange, and or the yummy. Oscar N. Reteep, a round man with a short white beard and very little hair on the top of his head, waved at them from his front porch where he sat in a rocking chair puffing on a long pipe. He had combed long wisps of hair over his freckled brown egg of a head in a vain attempt to hide the fact that he was bald. The breeze was stirring a loud tendril of the hair about as if it were waving at the children, too. "Ho there, Janner," he called, smiling and beckoning to the children. "Hello, Mr. Reteep," Janner hollered over the noise of the crowd. From the window behind Oscar, a little man with pointed ears watched him. Zuzab Coit was a ridge runner whom Oscar had adopted 6 years earlier upon opening a crate that was supposed to have been full of books from Torboro. Instead, Oscar had been shocked to find a starving, frightened Zuzab cowering inside. Ridge runners were little people, and they were little known in Scree, but Oscar, a self-proclaimed appreciator of the neat, the strange, and or the yummy, decided that Zuzab most certainly qualified. Zuzab's description of his homeland and harrowing life in the Kill Ridge Mountains were very neat, as were his stubby hair and pointed features. His dress and behavior were quite strange. He wore leather breeches and a patchwork shirt of many colors that billowed around him like 100 tiny flags. Strangest of all, he couldn't help climbing on everything taller than himself, which was most things. As for his being yummy, Oscar didn't care to speculate. Jenner thought how they looked rather silly together. Oscar round as a pumpkin and Zuzab short and thin as a shorn weed. Lily waved at Zuzab. His beady eyes widened and he ducked out of sight. "Where's Podo?" Oscar asked, wiping his glasses on his vest. Jenner tried to sound nonchalant. "Back at the cottage, said we could come along today." "Ho!" Oscar eyed Jenner through the spectacles perched back on the end of his nose. Jenner beamed. "Come bright and early, day after tomorrow, huh? I found an absolute trove of books on my last trip to Dugtown. I'll need help loading them in." "Yes, sir, I'll be there." Janner began to think of all the books he would read next. Oscar squinted one eye at Tink and looked him up and down. "And bring that skin and bones brother of yours, too. We could use the extra hand, and by the look of it, he could use some exercise." Tink's eyes widened. "Really, Mr. Reteep?" "That's right, lad." Oscar smiled down at Lily. "What do you think of all this fuss, lass? Glipwood is a different town for a day, isn't it?" Lily looked around at the folk milling past them, taking in the sights, sounds, and smells that were so foreign to the sleepy little township. She smiled. "I like it, but after a day of it, I'll be glad when things are back to normal." Janner rolled his eyes. "Well, I wish Glipwood was like this every day. I wish the only inn was always full of travelers and merchants with news from Torboro and from Fort Lamedron, or tales from explorers who'd gone beyond the edges of the maps. Did you ever think about the fact that there might be a whole continent that no one from Scree has ever heard of, that no one anywhere has ever seen? We've never even been to Fort Lamedron, and Podo says it's only a day's ride from here. All these rich people from Dugtown and Torboro get to really see, here we are, not just shovel hay all day." Oscar raised his eyebrows at Janner, whose speech trailed off at a quizzical reaction of his friend. Oscar then wiped his brow and pressed the single waving lock of Reteep's hair back to his forehead. "So Glipwood is too small for Janner. What do you say, young Tink?" Tink sniffed the air. "I want some sugarberry pie." "Janner," Oscar said, "there's more to the world than just seeing it. If you can't find peace here in Glipwood, you won't find it anywhere." Oscar gestured at a carriage rolling by. "These folks may appear wealthy, but no one really is anymore. If you look close enough, you'll see the suits and dresses these so-called rich folks are wearing are tattered and patched. No earrings or necklaces adorn the women, no rings sparkle on the men's fingers. Janitor saw that it was true. Why hadn't he ever noticed that before? Annoyed, he nodded to Oscar and toed at the dirt. It was his day to be corrected by the grown-ups, he thought. Lad, it's one thing to be poor in pocket. Nothing wrong with that. But poor in heart, that's no good. Look at them. They're sad in the eyes. It's a sadness no amount of money could repair. Why? They hardly remember what it's like to laugh from the belly anymore. But they seem to be happy, Mr. Recheap, don't they? We could hear the laughter music from up the lane, Lily said. People come to Glipwood to see the dragons because it's one of the only freedoms they have left. Sure, they sleep under their own roofs and their own families, and broken though it is, this is still their own land. But this is a far fling from freedom, young Igabys. Some of us still remember what it was like to stroll through town after dark or to ride a horse through the forest without fear. Oscar's voice grew angry, and it seemed to Janitor that he was no longer talking to them, but to himself. It's beginning to feel like the Fangs have always been here. That Nag, the Nameless, has always ruled us, taxed us, and stolen our young. Janitor looked at the half-smiles on the people's faces. He saw the way the people cowered away from the sneering Fangs on the jail stoop. There was sorrow underneath all the merriment, and for the first time, Janitor was old enough to feel it. Oscar came back to himself and smiled at the children. Ah, but it's a fine day, is it not, Igby children? There's a time to think hard, and there's a time to ease up. Now you run along. As the great thumb of the Honk Meadow wisely wrote, the games are starting soon enough. Oscar waved them on with a wink while he puffed his pipe and planted his hair back to his bald pate. With somber hearts, the children made their way down the crowded street. Janitor was deep in thought, staring hard at Commander Norm, the fattest and meanest Fang in Glipwood. Norm's feet were propped on an old stump, and he was gnawing the meat from a hen bone, his long purple tongue slurping noisily. Norm hurled the bone at the old man walking by, and the Fang soldiers hissed and laughed as the man bowed and wiped the grease from his face. Janitor found it hard to believe that there was a day when no one in Scree had ever heard of the Fangs of Dang. Past the jail, in front of the little building that housed the printing press, a cluster of people stood in a circle laughing at something. Above the heads of the onlookers, two ragged boots were kicking around in the air. Janitor and Tink grinned at one another. Pete, the sock man, Tink pointed and took off running. Come on, Lily, let's see what he's up to. They pushed through the crowd, and they saw the strange fellow walking on his hands in the middle of the street. He was chanting the phrase, wings and dings and purple things, over and over, kicking his feet to the rhythm. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were shadowed, and the creases along them gave him the look of having just finished crying. He wore ragged clothes and was filthy as were the dingy knitted stockings he wore on his arms up past his elbows. Onlookers tossed coins, but to the residents of Glipwood, this was normal behavior for Pete. Earlier that summer, in fact, Pete crashed into the street sign at the corner of Main and Vibley Way, which was quite innocent as it was standing still and in plain sight. After insulting the sign's mother, Pete challenged it to a contest, though it quite stoically showed no sign of retaliation. He took a hard swipe at it, missed, spun in a circle like a circus dancer from Dugtown, and collapsed into the dirt where he had snored noisily all the night. Janitor applauded with the crowd as Pete slipped back onto his feet, adjusted his hair with a flourish, and skipped away with one eye closed and a soaked hand in his mouth, leaving the coins in the dust. Janitor grinned after Pete, whose bushy head bounced up the dusty side street and around the corner. And he's gone, Janitor said. Do you think it's true that he lives up there near the old forest? Tink asked. Janitor shrugged. He'd have to be crazy to live there. In the years before the war, rangers and trappers braved the forest and tamed the deadly beasts that prowled within it. But the Fangs had taken every weapon in the land, every sword and shield, every bow and arrow, every dagger, every spear, from every farm that could be used as a weapon. and that was locked away and guarded. Well, if anybody's crazy enough to go near the forest, it's Pete. Tink paused. The Blackest boys said they saw him riding a toothy cow like it was a horse up by the forest, whipping its rear with a switch and singing a ballad. Janner snorted. No way, nobody could survive a toothy cow. Besides, the Blackest boys are too jumpy to go anywhere near the forest. They are pulling your strings. Janner turned to go. Come on. But he stopped in his tracks and grabbed his brother's arms. He couldn't see Lily. His head whipped to and fro, scanning the crowded street. Where's Lily? He cried. Lily! Tink tapped him on the shoulder. Janner whirled around to find his brother pointing to the ground at Janner's feet. Lily was sitting there, scratching Nugget's belly, looking up at him innocently. He sighed and felt his insides quiver with relief. In the space of a few seconds, he had envisioned Lily lost or hurt, and he felt a tinge of the painful guilt he'd bear if something actually really happened to her. But nothing ever does, he thought bitterly. Here we are at the Dragon Day Festival, and I'm a curious mess since the minute we arrived over nothing at all. What could possibly happen in just a few seconds?